Welcome to Tower Talk Business Radio, where we bring you conversations with the top business minds on Long Island and around the nation every week. Featuring expert consultants and small business owners who have found success but are also willing to share their top tips, failures, and give gritty, matter-of-fact advice based on their firsthand experience. Now, let's get down to business on Tower Talk Business Radio on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, and welcome to Tower Talk Business Radio. My name is Ray Schwetz, AVP of Business Banking at Jovia Financial Credit Union, and we're focused on being the premier resource for business and entrepreneurship. We bring you weekly business advice, tips, tools, and services that help you grow your business. Plus, we interview top business leaders in the industry, and occasionally we get really cool celebrity authors. So I'm very excited. It seems very apropos that empowering us today is Julian David Stone. He's the author of The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl. Justice Girl is a story that takes us back in time to the 50s and the early days of TV, well before the internet and social media, to the days of blacklisting and fears of communism, and a time where Superman was played by George Reeves. We spoke a while back about his novel, It's Alive, another favorite of mine, about the days before the coming of the film Frankenstein and the folks involved in the making of that. And we're very excited here to talk tonight about, today about Justice Girl. So welcome to the show, Julian. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me on again. It's great to be chatting with you.
Give us a little bit about your background, because you have a really cool, unique background.
Sure. I was a screenwriter here in Hollywood for about 10 or 15 years. And then over a few years, I sort of transitioned into writing novels. And that's what I do now. And as you mentioned, my latest one, It's Alive, came out just, I believe, under a year ago. And that one's about, the universal monsters and the beginning of the making of Dracula and Frankenstein and all of that. And from that, you were kind enough to read one of my earlier ones, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, it was a really fun read, and you've read a good book when you are sad that it's over and you turn that last page. You feel like you accomplished something, but you want more. So, very exciting stuff. Now, what made you want to transition from that type of work to being an author now? Well,
I'll tell you, it was a couple of things. One, as you get older in Hollywood, ageism is kind of a bit of a reality. So that was a factor. I definitely wasn't getting the meetings that I was getting previously. But also, as I got older and I was in a situation where I was not as driven financially by having to take certain jobs that I didn't want to take and more being able to follow my passions, I found that writing books allowed me to follow those passions much more than, doing screenplays. Because with screenplays, you're dealing with a very specific audience and you have to appeal differently than you do with a novel. So I made the transition to writing novels, and I found that I could write things like Justice Girl and It's Alive and not worry about who's going to buy this. With books, it's, you can write to a much more niche audience. Also, I found it very freeing not being constrained by the length. A screenplay has to be a certain number of pages and a certain structure, and it was incredibly freeing. You can let it develop much more organically than you can with a screenplay.
Sure, and also no budget. You don't have to worry about it. No limits to the imagination.
Exactly.
Now, in your work, have you seen, obviously, a lot's changed over the years with publishing. So what's been your experience there?
Well, when I did Justice Girl, I actually, that was my first novel. And what I learned so much from the first one in terms of, how much work you had to do before it actually came out and that sort of thing. Obviously, that was one of the biggest learning experiences, how much in advance before the release you start publicizing it and all of that. And also now, obviously, self-publishing market has exploded, which is another element that allows you, tremendous freedom. You can write anything. All the gatekeepers are sort of going away. And it's great. You can directly have a book published and, go greatly out there, directly to an audience. So that's one of the major changes that used to be much more difficult to do that. Now it's super easy, or you can just do a book digitally. doesn't even have to exist as a print one. So there's been, tremendous changes just in the publishing industry since my first novel.
Yeah, that makes things so much easier as far as reaching an audience. How do you find it as a business? Is it still something that's lucrative?
Not as lucrative as the screenwriting. I will admit that, and again, that was one of the things that I was fortunate that I was in a position from the success I had as a screenwriter to not now be able to not have to worry about that as much, and to sort of, if I break even or make a little bit, I can let the satisfaction be what I get out of it, as opposed to the financial reward, where the screenplays definitely paid a lot better, but ultimately were a lot less satisfying and kind of empty in the end, which was one of the factors, besides sort of getting older, why I stopped doing it. I found it extremely unsatisfying, because what was even considered success, and we may have covered this last time we spoke, I would spend months and months on a screenplay and I would sell it, and then it might never get made. So essentially you're just creating piles of paper that end up on a shelf. And I found that extremely unsatisfying. And now with, the much more ease of publishing and digital publishing, you get it to an audience, and that's really what it's all about. And that's where the satisfaction comes, from people enjoying what you write.
Yeah, and you can definitely find those people a lot more directly. It's kind of interesting, and we might have mentioned this last time we spoke, but I had met with a filmmaker by the name of Jeff Lieberman, who made films like Blue Sunshine, Squirm, and Just Before Dawn, mostly in like the horror genre. And he said to me, he goes, "I made the most money on the projects that never got made."
Yeah.
Which is just bizarre to me. But
Yep.
But there you go. So let's talk more about Justice Girl, the reason that we're here. Very excited again to talk about it. And folks who are not aware of Justice Girl, can you just give us a little taste of what it's about?
Sure. Justice Girl is the story of a writer during the golden age of television. This is generally referred to the 1950s. And this was an era before videotape was invented, where all of television was live. Literally everything you saw on your TV screen was happening at that moment in a studio somewhere, mostly in New York, but other places occasionally. And it's about a writer who, through crazy circumstances, creates an extremely popular character. And it's about what happens with this character and how different people sort of use it for for different political means, and just the crazy adventure of getting a show on the air every week at 8:00. When that second hand hits 8:00, that show's got to happen. And so it's part of that excitement. And also it's against the backdrop, as you mentioned, of the 1950s, where there was a tremendous amount of blacklisting and a lot of politics coming out of the post-World War II era, or this being the post-World War II era, that factored into what was going on television screens. And it's mainly about this writer named Johnny Derby, who creates this character, but it also tells it from the point of view of the actress who plays the main character, who is Justice Girl. This is the era of Superman being popular. So this is a Superman type of superhero named Justice Girl. And it tells about her experiences being the lead actress in the show, and also about the head of the network. I created a mythical fourth network to go with ABC, CBS, and NBC, and called the Regal Television Network, kind of based on the Dumont Network, which is kind of a little known network from that period that lasted for a number of years and disappeared in the mid-50s. So it tells the story from the point of view of the three of them, but primarily from the point of view of this writer.
Yeah, and it really does. You put the reader in that time period, and that's one of the things that I found fascinating about it, is that I felt like that little boy watching Superman on TV, and it wasn't quite the same as, that you had to watch it live, but you couldn't record it. It wasn't streaming. It wasn't on demand. It was, I caught it at my grandmother's house on her TV, or I didn't see it. An amazing and very creative time. And there's so many classics that came out of that era, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and so many great science fiction shows and movies. Oh,
it was a great era. And particularly, there was this period up until the late 50s when videotape came in and changed it all, when you had these live dramas being done on television pretty much from the end of World War II in 45 up until the late 50s that were incredible. They would do incredible things live with walls flying out, and they didn't let the fact that it was live keep them from doing incredibly intricate dramas. And a lot of them ended up being turned into movies. And it was an era that I really loved. 12 Angry Men was first originally done as a live TV production. Marty was done that way. Requiem for a Heavyweight. There was a whole bunch of them, and it was an era and an art form that I became a little bit obsessed with, and that's why I wanted to tell a story within this world, because people don't realize that there was this period where television, they put on just as many shows as today, but they were all live, and I just find that incredible. It was just a really fascinating era.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of planted the seed in your head for this story.
Oh, absolutely. I actually got in, I sort of discovered the era through Rod Serling, because Rod Serling, who, but one of my, when I was sort of starting my interest in being a writer as a teenager, I discovered the Twilight Zone and Rod Serling. Well, Rod Serling became famous in the golden age of television. He wrote tons, hours and hours and hours of live television, but he became very famous for a drama called Patterns, which is an absolutely amazing piece of work. And it literally, his life changed overnight. He talks about that the night that it aired, he went out to dinner. It was being done live and he had nothing to do with the production. And he came home and his phone was ringing and it never stopped ringing for the rest of his life. And it all changed because of this 1 hour drama called Patterns.
Now, you mentioned that the mythical Fourth Network was inspired by the Dumont. Were there any characters in the story that were inspired by some real life folks?
Not so much as sort of amalgams of people. I think the main character, the writer, Johnny Derby, was I wouldn't say based on Serling, but the same sort of the young writer trying to break in, and that was certainly a Serling-esque character. The sort of angry young man sort of prototype. That was very prevalent. That was one of the things too, was that so many of the people were so young during that era. And also one of the things that was interesting, because it was live, the advertisers and the network people didn't have the same control that they have today. It was kind of a little bit out of their control. And also because television was so based in sort of cities, they weren't trying necessarily to write for the lowest common denominator. So you had more sophisticated dramas being done. It was really just a fascinating era.
Now, tell us about the process of writing the book. I know when we discussed It's Alive, you had a very specific process that you followed, which I found fascinating. Was it similar in Justice Girl? How you did your research?
Yeah, it was the same thing. I sort of dived straight into the world. I had one difference with this, because it took place in the 50s instead of the 30s. People who had been part of that world were still alive. So I got to, there were a lot more contemporaneous interviews that I read. I did the same research. I read, stuff from the period, but I got to talk to people that were part of this. And the one thing that was really interesting to a person, none of them wanted it to end. Like, to them, this live era was a real golden age. And once it went to tape, many of them had amazing careers, but it was never quite the same, because you had the rush of live drama, and they never experienced that again. So, that was something that I thought was really interesting. I'm sort of jealous of them. It's kind of, as much as I loved It's Alive in the 30s, this is, if there was ever a prototype of what I wanted to be, it was Johnny Derby. I wanted to be a young writer in this period, or director, because I've done some directing of live things, and it's really quite a rush to do. And so that was a big part of the research that was different than It's Alive. So I read a lot of stuff. I talked to people, and then I started writing. And, again, what was really freeing, because this was my first novel. So the ability to just go where the story takes you. One of the things that came when I started writing it, I had no intention of including flashbacks to World War II. But then as it developed, I suddenly realized I wanted to have a flashback during World War II, because I'm also very fascinated by the American home front during World War II. It's another era that I find really fascinating. And so I found a way that each character had an experience during this period in the American home front, but also involved television, because people don't realize how far back television really goes. That there were prototypes as early as the late 1920s. And, it really exploded after World War II, but it existed before the war and was used in some forms during the war in various incarnations. So that was something that came about as I started doing the story. I had no intention of that, but as it developed, that got included. So that was kind of the process, just following where the story goes.
Yeah, and I love that you did include that material, those flashbacks to World War II, because that really informs the relationships of certain characters. It also really informs the motivation of certain characters and how they became who they are and that sort of thing. So I'm really glad that you went that route. In terms of the structure of the story, I also loved how you kind of introduced each next chapter as an episode of the TV show. So was that something that you kind of knew from right off the bat, or was that something that kind of developed as you were writing the story? How did that come into play?
It was another thing that kind of developed. I think I figured it out pretty early. I kind of did a similar thing in It's Alive, where I sort of like had the structure of the days leading up. It helps me to sort of organize the material, to sort of break it down. So I thought it was fun that I could, break down each week of the of Justice Girl with the episode that they were shooting that week. So it kind of gave it, and it was fun creating, names for the episodes and all of that. So it was just a fun way to delineate the time and, show how the show was evolving and how things were changing.
You were listening to Tara Talk Business Radio on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ray Schwetz, and our guest today is Julian David Stone. He's the author of The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl. What were some of the biggest challenges that you had presenting this story and getting it published? Because, it's kind of like I compare it a lot to Steven Spielberg with Raiders of the Lost Ark. When that came out and they said they were making a movie about like 30 serial cliffhangers, and, I'm sure the studio heads were kind of like, huh? Why would you want to do that? Did you have folks around you who were kind of like, well, what are you going to do with this?
A little bit. My agent was certainly perplexed. The nice thing, like, again, in the world of books, there's so much more. If I had sat down to write it as a screenplay, that would have gone nowhere. So in the world of books, there's such a range of stuff, so you don't really get that. It's more people want to see it when it's done. And the irony was, very quickly after it came out, it was optioned and for a long time was in development to be a TV series, because that's something that I think it would lend itself very well to, and something I still hope that happens, but at the moment it's not particularly moving, but for a number of years it was. So there wasn't too much pushback. Again, in books, you can kind of do anything. It's kind of what's on the page. Like I said, the real learning thing being my first book, I learned so much about what you need to do before it comes out. That there's certain people that won't even review the book once it's out. It's a very different. So I did things very different with It's Alive. And I also have a book of, if you want to complete my current trilogy, I also have my rock and roll book. I don't know if we talked about that, but that one has also had an interesting journey and was a lot of fun to put together. But that one, I sort of had learned the work you put in before it comes out, and that was helpful. And then by the time I got to It's Alive, I started 9 months in advance. So you really learn the whole cycle of what to do. The books get announced a year in advance and they start building publicity through all of that.
Yeah, I definitely see how that happens with some of the releases that I see coming out. And that was definitely something I had in mind. I was wondering how your past experience, because you've written the rock and roll book, and obviously there are different topics, and I'm sure you had different approaches to each subject. But yeah, I was wondering how that work kind of informed what you're doing now. So I think you partially answered that, but let's talk a little bit about the rock and roll book and how that kind of came up.
Sure. Well, that one was kind of came out of nowhere. It's when I was a teenager, I used to smuggle my camera into concerts in the early to mid 80s. And so for basically 30, I gave it up. Even though I was doing this and my career was kind of taking off as a rock and roll photographer, I went off to film school. And at a certain point, I had to make a choice between the two. And I chose, to go into the film business, a choice I'm still questioning to this day sometimes. But I had over 10,000 images of some of the biggest acts from the 80s, and I just kind of forgot about it and put it away for 30 years. And then I'll try to make this quick, but when Bowie and Prince passed away. I posted some pictures on Facebook that I had taken, and all of a sudden I got all these queries from people going like, how do you have these pictures? What's the story here? And somebody, mentioned, you should put a book together. And my first response was, sure, that would be great, but there's lots of photos of these guys. What is unique? And then when I realized that I had an amazing story to tell along with it about being a teenager and smuggling the equipment into the shows, then I was like, there's a book. So now, combined with all the photos, I have all these crazy stories. And again, you were talking about like the structure that I created for Justice Girl and also for It's Alive. I had the structure in this of telling this journey of a kid who loved rock and roll through each concert as I got more sophisticated with how I was smuggling the equipment in, and crazy things that happened, being chased by roadies and security and getting kicked out of shows sometimes, and how I eventually became a professional because the work was good, and then what made me eventually give it up. So it lended itself to a good story, and that's when I realized I had a book. And interestingly, I hate to admit this, but of the 3 books that I have, it's by far my best selling one. It just keeps selling and selling because it's a big, beautiful coffee table book. So it has a lot of appeal that way. Although It's Alive is doing very well. The rock and roll book, I don't do any publicity. It just keeps selling. It's really funny that it just keeps going along. So, that one's been a lot of fun and just was an interesting journey how it all came about.
Yeah, I think, and you kind of hit it too before when you were talking about some of the niche products, like or niche books, is that with Justice Girl and with It's Alive, there are very specific built-in audiences that automatically would kind of gravitate towards that, and then it's selling it on other people who are kind of outside of that world and may not know about it. Whereas with the rock and roll book, there's definitely a built-in audience, and the nostalgia is so big right now for that type of stuff.
Just to throw out the title is No Cameras Allowed. My career as a rock and roll. My career as an outlaw rock and roll photographer. So just want to throw that in there.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're talking about it, so
and that's the story. So very cool stuff. Now, one of the things that you're doing very well, at least in my opinion, because it found me, was the social media campaign for It's Alive, and then in turn for Justice Girl. It's funny because, Big Brother's listening, because as soon as I started thinking about buying Justice Girl, it showed up in my Facebook feed.
Well, that's good. I love Justice Girl. It was my first novel, and like I said, I still want to see it be a series. And yeah, it's all of my passions. Like I said, I'm very passionate about that era of 50s live television. And, I really recommend to any of your listeners to go onto YouTube. A lot of those live dramas are on there and you can see them for free. Patterns is amazing. The creator of Mad Men, Charlie, was it Charlie Wiener? What's the name of Matthew Weiner, the guy who created Mad Men. Mm-hmm. He made, I saw him very famously talk about that he made the entire writing staff of Mad Men watch Patterns, because it's about the sort of the high stakes world of of a business company in New York City. And it's a very powerful drama still to this day. And there's, so many of them out there, and you can see them for free on YouTube. And that's the world that I wanted to write about, a live television show and all of the excitement and that went into putting it on. Yeah.
And I think that really lends itself, as I was reading the story, it was definitely, there was a visual element that just came to me immediately about that. And it gave me that rush as the reader. I was following along, so I can imagine it being like a Netflix series or a Prime TV series. So hopefully somebody is listening from those areas, and they will
yes,
they will go, that's a good idea. We should do that, because I'd love to see it.
So would I.
And as far as the promotions, I mentioned the social media. Another thing that I see that you're doing is that you're kind of going around and you're talking to various groups and audiences, doing kind of a tour of your own. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's something new that's come up that I have to say has been an absolute thrill. It's kind of turned into a one-man show. I have a presentation that I do, and I've done it 4 or 5 times now, and it's been great every time, about Carl Laemmle Jr. or Junior Laemmle and the origins of the Universal Monsters. It's an hour-long presentation that I do completely extemporaneously from, while going through a PowerPoint. And I just tell his story of this, person who, basically, and again, it's kind of what my novel's about, but more specifically, it's about, you have these characters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, the Bride of Frankenstein. These are some of the most famous images from the history of cinema, and everybody knows them. Everybody knows the actors who play them, but nobody has heard of the person most responsible for them existing, and that's Carl Laemmle Jr. And so I tell the story of, he was running Universal at the time and chose to make the films, and I tell his story from birth to death, and also part of his, and it's some of what's in the novel, but some of the actual things that happened in his life that informed the fact that he chose to make these movies. And so it's really been exciting. And I've got, like I said, I've done it 4 or 5 times already, and I've got 6 bookings coming up in October to do it. And then I've already got a booking for next July 21st to do it. It's just a perfect match at horror conventions and film festivals that sort of cater to classic cinema. So it's been really fun, and it's a real blast doing it, and I hope to do it a lot, because it's really been fun.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a few organizers out there who are listening, so I hope that they hear that.
Reach out. I'd love to do it. I really, it's fun, and it goes over really well. That's the best part, is that it's gotten great response. Again, you can go on YouTube, and even some people have posted clips of it and commented on how much they enjoyed it. So that's really been, and that goes back to, again, why I stopped writing screenplays, because all of this is about wanting to interact with an audience and get a reaction to what you're doing. And screenplays are just months and months and months of work. And then what's considered a success is somebody says, great, thank you, and most of the time puts it on a shelf, and not the most satisfying thing.
No, certainly not for a creative type. So kudos to you for doing what you do. Well, what's the one thought that you'd like to leave our listener with today?
God, I guess, thank you for listening to the interview, and, check out my work. You can go to juliandavidstone.com, and all 3 of the projects we've discussed are there. And, I just want to thank you for having me on. It's fun to, I haven't talked about Justice Girl in a long time. And, I definitely love it. It's all the things I'm very interested in: the American home front during World War II, the era of live television. So it's fun to sort of dip back into that. And I'm really pleased that you enjoyed it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I enjoyed reading the book. I'm happy to share it with other folks and recommend it. It's on my Goodreads already, my review. Really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I would say that, look, for folks who are looking for a story about something that is a bygone era and something very exciting and something, it's worth exploring. It's worth taking a trip. So thanks so much for joining us, Julian.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And we look forward to your next work, and we look forward to seeing you, hopefully at a convention near you.
Yes. Yes.
My name is Ray Schwetz. I'm here with guest Julian David Stone, author of Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl. We want to thank you for being with us. Visit nccradio.org for more information. We are available on Odyssey, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, as a podcast on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This has been Tower Talk Business Radio, powered by the voice of National Community College, 90.3 WHPC.